Dr. Nardi here, back with another video. And in this video, we are going to discuss evaluating and interpreting research. But before I get started, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video. Now, let's go ahead and talk about some key points related to our evaluating and interpreting research. First point I want to make is be wary of any sources that offer proof or they say that they have facts or their research is truth. And the reason I say that is nothing is ever proven in science, right? There's always research that might provide more support for one theory than another theory. However, nothing is ever proven. Science is always changing, and what we believe to be true today may not be true tomorrow. So always keep that in mind. The other thing a good researcher should do is distinguish between quantitative and qualitative research. Now, when you think about it, if we kind of look on the surface level, quantitative research can be distinguished from qualitative research in terms of results. Now, in quantitative research, the results are presented as quantities or numbers. Think your statistics classes, right? Think back to when you took those stats classes. While qualitative research, the results tend to be themes that are described in words. Now, another important distinction is that quantitative researchers emphasize the generality, or I should say the generalizability of their research and how their sample can be generalized to a larger population. And you'll often see them use methods such as questionnaires, attitude scales, achievement tests, and things like that. And they often administer their research study to large samples. Now, qualitative research emphasizes the collection of in-depth information that's usually obtained from small samples, and we don't really use the word generalizability because we're not generalizing to a larger population. Instead, we think about exploring something in depth, and we often will see like interviews, very long form interviews potentially of participants. Again, both of these methodologies have their place, but make sure you distinguish between the two types of research designs. I would also like to note that quantitative researchers prefer probability samples. And all I mean by that is when you're doing a quantitative study, the ideal approach would be probability sampling. Now, there's different variations of it, but the most simplest is if you just have a simple random sample. And that means that you pick from your population at random, and everybody in your population has an equal opportunity to be part of your research study. However, most of the times, you cannot completely identify your population, so you can't really have what we call a sampling frame. So then, unfortunately, simple random sampling is not possible. Often, instead, researchers will kind of shift their work towards more of convenience samples. And if you think about it, a lot of the stuff in the social sciences is conducted in colleges and uses like psychology students for their sample as opposed to a truly random probability sample. Qualitative researchers prefer purposive samples. Now, qualitative researchers do not really strive to make generalizations to the population. They don't usually attempt probability sampling. Instead, their samples are more direct and have a purpose. So individuals are selected based on a researcher's knowledge of the population and the purpose of the study. So they often include individuals that might have good sources of information for the study. And often the researchers have certain criteria that they might use in order to recruit their samples. Couple other things that I want to note for this video is be very cautious when a body of literature has a common sampling flaw. So it's not unusual to find an entire body of research on a topic that has a common sampling flaw. For instance, most research in the social and behavioral sciences is conducted by professors who have limited resources. So as a result of that, large proportions of studies are conducted within college/universities with students who are the sample, as I mentioned earlier, the convenience sample. And these participants have to volunteer. So we do not know how people who would not normally volunteer respond, and B, we often do not know how non-college students would respond. So this is a common sampling flaw that we see in the social sciences. The other thing I want to note is there is no single perfect way to measure most traits. Now, measures in research, if you look at the research, the methodology section, you'll see that they vary greatly from highly structured, such as you'll see multiple choice achievement tests or personality scales, or you'll also see highly unstructured, such as very free-flowing interviews. Now, there is no perfect way to collect your data. Every method you might use or every approach you use has a strength and an affordance. So always keep that in mind, and always keep that in mind when you're reading other individual studies, right? So for example, if you're going to use a survey design, there are a lot of strengths to that. You can send it out to a lot of people. It's inexpensive. You can be very efficient in your data collection. However, there's also limitations. Sometimes there is social desirability that creeps in, and people do not answer honestly. They answer the way that is socially acceptable. Sometimes the questions on your instrument might be confusing, and maybe there's issues with what we call the anchors. Or if you think about an instrument that has like a 1 to 7, and 1 being never, 7 being always, and then in the middle it says sometimes. When you're reading that as a participant, sometimes that can be confusing what the word means by like sometimes. Like, what does sometimes mean? So we refer to those words as, never and always as anchors. And we often talk about a confusion that can arise if the study or the instrument is not designed well. I will say this, though, I would definitely include research studies that use multiple measures, or what we refer to as triangulation. So you don't want to rely on just one type of measurement for your research study. So you don't want to just do surveys. You probably would want to include also interviews or some kind of observation. Again, I would look for studies that have this. They're much stronger studies. I will say, though, on those lines, be cautious when a body of literature has a common measurement flaw. So again, it's not unusual to find an entire body of research on a topic with a common measurement flaw. For example, a lot of researchers use self-reports, as I mentioned earlier. So you'll see that, there's that social desirability that kind of creeps in, and that people answer the way that they are expected to answer, or they think you want them to answer. So always be mindful of the flaws in each type of research design. Also, consider the reliability of your measurement instruments that you're using. And remember, reliability refers to consistency of your results, right? So if I give a test of algebra today, and I give you the same test a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, you should roughly get the same score. Usually you'll see that in IQ tests. If I give you an IQ test today, you should roughly get the same score in a week, a year, or 10 years from now, because IQ is a stable construct and doesn't change. So if my IQ test is reliable, then I should see roughly the consistent scores across the board. And you want to make sure that the instruments you pick are reliable. You also want to make sure that your instruments are valid. And all that means is, are your instruments measuring what they're intending to measure, or what they're intended to measure? So if you're looking at an instrument to measure student engagement, you better make sure that instrument's measuring student engagement and not some kind of related construct. So be very careful, again, with picking picking the studies with reliable and valid instruments. Now, if you do your own study, you definitely want valid and reliable instruments. If you're looking at a qualitative study, I would consider what the interview protocols were. Was it a semi-structured interview? Was it a structured interview? How was the interview designed? So was it, open-ended, right? Did they just let people talk? Was it very structured, meaning they have questions ahead of time and they stuck exactly to those questions? Was it semi-structured, where you have a mix of like open-ended interview style and also very structured questions? Again, this could make a difference. Also, the skill of the interviewer makes a difference too. So make sure you're mindful of that. When you think about qualitative research, make sure that there are adequate control measures in qualitative research. And the two most common is peer review. And all that is having an outside researcher review the entire research process. And the second one is member checking. And that's having participants in the research review the researcher's interpretation for accuracy. Again, keep that in mind as you're reading other people's studies. Also, when you look through that methods section, consider the researcher's self-critiques of their own research. Now, you'll notice that researchers often point out major flaws in their research methodology. Now, typically these flaws that the researchers could not overcome because of limited resources, such as time, or there's some kind of flaw across participants. But you should be very mindful of this and take note of the critiques of the research studies you're reading. Now, be very cautious with quantitative researchers who refer to causality. Now, the gold standard here is an experimental design, and that's the only way you can get at cause and effect. However, some other researchers that use maybe quasi-experimental designs or correlational designs or longitudinal designs try to get a causality, so be very, very careful. Also, along the same lines is when qualitative researchers try to refer to causality, again, it's very hard or impossible to infer causality if you do not have an experiment, if you don't have this came before that, and you don't have control of your variables that you're studying. So again, be cautious in individuals' interpretations. And you have to be careful when you're reading the discussion section that they're not giving you any causal explanations. Because again, you usually can't infer causality unless you have a true experiment. And the last couple of points I will make is you want to assess the strengths of the trends across the studies when evaluating the literature. So you have to assume that all research is flawed in some way. It is. That's how it is, by the way. That's all research is flawed. However, you have to look at the strengths as well as the weaknesses. So look at what the researchers did well. Look at what is emphasized in their methodologies, and you can kind of tease apart the stronger studies from the weaker studies. The last thing I'll mention in this video is thinking about significance testing. Now, quantitative researchers conduct significance testing, and you want to be cautious in this interpretation, because just because something's statistically significant doesn't mean it's practically significant. So you want to be cautious in your interpretation. You have to ask yourself and think about it. What is the practical significance of these results? Anyway, that's all I got for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and share. and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye for now.